With the loss of Richard McSpadden and Russ Francis still fresh in our minds and hearts, the NTSB has released its preliminary report of that October 1st crash that took their lives so tragically and just so suddenly. The main question, I think, on everyone's minds is why did that engine have a partial or a complete power loss event that led them to trying to make the turn back to the airport? I think the most logical explanation from reading this evidence is a stuck exhaust valve, and I will explain why. Let's get into the details together. What I'm doing as an instructor with 2,000 hours of experience in these small general aviation airplanes, I'm looking for things that do not represent the norm, things that look different from a typical flight. The first thing that jumped out to me, beyond it being just an interesting formation photography flight, the first thing that really caught my eye was a witness that said that the accident airplane's engine was shut off during the taxi phase and then was restarted. This means that they likely experienced some sort of engine-related anomaly at this point, and they are trying to just start over from scratch. It wouldn't be an electrical anomaly or an avionics anomaly, because with that, you could just turn off the master switch and reboot everything with the engine still running, and that would still work. So there'll be more on this later that I mentioned, but clearly in my mind, this is a clear piece of evidence that they started to suspect something with the engine at this point. Then there's a witness account that I put into question because the witness said the propeller was set for climb and not takeoff. To me, I stopped at that sentence and it kind of messed with my brain a little bit, because usually climb and takeoff settings are virtually the same with very little RPM difference. In these controllable pitch propeller airplanes where you have a blue lever that controls the RPM of the propeller, usually you pull it back ever so slightly during the initial climb out when you're about 1,000 feet above the ground. So for a witness to say it was set for climb and not takeoff, either this is an NTSB typo or the witness is misspoke or something, because this just does not make sense to me. The only thing that they could potentially mean is that it wasn't generating the normal RPMs that they thought it would be for a takeoff roll. And then there's an engine surge, which could kind of support that. I don't really know if this is a true engine surge or this is just the normal part of the pilot applying full takeoff power. So I put this whole witness account into a little bit of like a giant question mark box. I have no idea whether or not we can really weigh this heavily. What we can weigh really heavily, though, is that the engine was shut off and then restarted. That is the biggest part that I learned from this. But here's another thing is, if two experienced pilots weren't experiencing full power on takeoff, I would fully expect them to pull the power to idle and to stop on the runway before they even became airborne. So that's another piece that doesn't make sense. If they weren't producing normal takeoff power, I doubt that Richard McSpadden would have let this flight continue. This witness doesn't really, is not credible to me. So the initial climb, to say that it does not sound as if it was running at full power, but yet the accident airplane is still turning to follow along its mission to do the formation flight, to join the other airplane. Again, this witness is not making sense to me. If there was a problem, they would have turned back at the first indication of a problem when they're this low to the ground. This is not something where you would take your focus off of the airplane and the engine and the instruments and then start to do a formation flight if anything at all was wrong with the airplane. So again, I don't like this witness testimony here. I think this just could be the case of you suspected something weird, but we don't know the aviation experience of this witness. So to me, I would like to know who this witness is and see their credentials and see what made them think that way. Or is this just a case of, after everything happened, oh yeah, that did sound a little bit different, but maybe it actually wasn't different. It's one of those things with memory where you can remember things a little bit differently because of the outcome. So the really interesting part here is that the airplane was about 1,000 feet away from its other airplane. It made a hard bank, a hard right turn back to the departure airport. And again, the sad, tragic piece of information here is that apparently Richard McSpadden keyed the mic and said to the rest of the traffic in the area, "We have a problem and we're returning to the airport." So this is the last transmission that we hear from the accident airplane. Then what follows is a description of the impact and of the damage, what the condition of the airport was, the details about the airplane, about the wind conditions, the weather conditions. All this stuff looks pretty standard to me. There's not much to see here. Again, these pilots had a lot of experience. The next interesting piece of data comes from this 36.7 hours of operation since major overhaul. This backs up the idea that engines in their infancy are some of the most dangerous things you can be flying, because the time where things go wrong is typically right after a major maintenance event occurs. So the fact that there's only 36 hours on the engine, that is a giant exclamation mark on how careful we must be when we're operating an engine that just had major maintenance done to it. Another interesting thing to think about here when you have only 36.7 hours is it's likely that the engine was just going through break-in procedures. What this usually means is you run the engine full rich at a high power setting, and what that does is that has the effect of the cylinder being broken in by the piston rings rubbing up against the side of the cylinder and shaving off parts of the scoring inside the cylinder that makes the oil stick uniformly to the edge of it. And it's shaving this off so that the engine can be properly operated and have maximum compression, and it have the oil adhere to the side of the cylinder normally. What's interesting about the break-in procedures is you are typically full rich a lot of the time, which means there's a lot of opportunity for buildup of carbon deposits and of lead bromide deposits around the engine, and those are actually precursors. Running an engine too rich is a precursor to a stuck valve. Now, the big question is, could a stuck valve happen in only 36 hours of operation? I think the danger zone is when you're taxiing, when you're at just the perfect temperature for lead bromide deposits to build up on the valve stem. And let me bring up a picture of that here. What a valve looks like. So you have the inside of the cylinder looks like this, where there's an intake valve, which is the larger one, and an exhaust valve, which is the smaller one. What happens is this valve moves up and down, and the guide is what makes it go in the right position. The guide is typically made out of a nickel material because that can withstand some really extreme heat, because what's happening is when this exhaust valve opens, there is hot gases that are in the combustion chamber that escape the combustion chamber and go out the exhaust. And this valve guide cannot be oil lubricated. There is no lubrication here. So this is a very critical part of the engine, the exhaust valve system. This has to be operating correctly. I had a student a couple of years ago experience in an engine power loss event where the valve got stuck in the open position. And what happens in the open position is when the combustion event occurs, there's not a complete seal inside the chamber, and thus there is almost no power generated, because as the engine is compressing its charge, that is going right out the exhaust really even before much combustion occurs. So the engine loses power in a cylinder very quickly when there is a stuck valve. And when you're having a 4-cylinder engine like this Lycoming IO360, it's a fuel-injected engine, you lose power very quickly. When you have one cylinder not working correctly, there's typically not enough power to make a controlled landing to whichever airport is nearby. You're typically landing it at the mercy of how much power you have left, which could be very little. This same thing happened to one of my students where there was a power loss event due to a stuck valve. However, the valve naturally unstuck itself and more power came back. That does not happen in all cases. But you lose a lot of power if the valve gets stuck in the open position, and even worse if the valve gets stuck in the wrong, too wide open. Then the piston head can strike the valve and snap it off, and the valve can after being severed can bounce around in the combustion chamber and just start punching holes through the engine, and really bad things can happen. But the most terrible outcome here is a complete loss of power. And the reason why this wouldn't show up in the post-accident examination is that these valves stick when they're really hot. And what happens is when you cool off that engine, the valve will naturally unstick itself and a spring will snap it back into position. And it's very hard to find any trace that the valve actually stuck besides what's called a wobble test. A wobble test is when you go and you find out how much room there is between this guide and the valve as it goes in and out through the guide. So I'm sure that's something that NTSB is going to be looking into, is how much wiggle room is there between the valve stem and the valve guide. If there's not very much, then it's highly likely that the conclusion of this will be that a stuck valve led to the engine power loss event. Here these pictures are of Continental exhaust valves, but Lycoming ones are very similar. The Lycoming ones are more of a mushroom shaped. They have sodium in the center. Sorry, my picture's kind of in the way. Let me just try to duck out of here for a second and give you a picture of what's going on here. So see if I can orient myself. So you have this is the Lycoming valve, and it's filled with this liquid sodium mixture that helps dissipate heat. And dissipating heat is the purpose of that design, to have the sodium filled center. So that's why it's designed that way. Unfortunately, Lycomings are more known for their valve sticking problem than Continental. Continental is more known for its valve burning problem. This is a picture of a valve that got burned over here. This is not from the accident airplane at all. This is just a sample picture of what can happen when there's a lot of lead bromide and carbon gunk buildup on the stem, which can happen if it's run at very rich mixture settings on the ground. So that's a very common outcome of running the engine too rich, is that you have valve sticking problems and emergency landings where you have very little power. Back in the 90s, Embry-Riddle got a bunch of Lycoming engines and new fleets of Cessnas, and they had a bunch of stuck valve problems, and they realized the root cause of this was they're running all their engines with a mixture set to full rich on the ground when they should have been aggressively leaning on the ground. So it's likely that since this engine was very close to its break-in period, that it was being run rich very often. I'm not sure if this is happening on the ground, and I'm sure if there's engine monitoring data available, they're going to be looking at that to see if it was run rich on the ground. And especially if there's engine monitoring data, the NTSB is going to look to see if there was one cylinder that went cold during this power loss event. If one cylinder went cold, then that's going to be a very clear valve stuck issue, especially when it looks like there's no oil leaking anywhere, that there's no fractures of the engine case system. They're going to take it apart and look at the camshaft, at the crankshaft, and look for abnormalities or weaknesses in the system. And my guess from reading this initial report is they're probably not going to find any significant wear events on the engine. It's such a low time engine as well. When looking at the rest of the report, nothing else looks anomalous from what we would expect to find in an accident airplane, besides the sentence here, where the fuel servo was attached with all lines tight and secure, but 4 hold-down nuts were found loose. But then they examined these torque stripes, which is essentially a think of it as like a putty that hardens, that shows evidence that a bolt is coming loose. They say in this that it did not appear that anything was that anything was coming loose abnormally, even though there was some looseness in this fuel servo. So to me, this is not a clear smoking gun of anything improper with the fuel system. One other bit of interesting information in here related to the cause of the engine failure could be that the thumb screw adjustment for the idle mixture, I'm assuming it's about the idle mixture, was found fractured and not connected. We don't know if this was caused by the impact, or if this happened mid-flight, or this happened between the time they were taxiing and took off. We don't know when this happened, and I'm sure they're looking into things that can cause this idle thumb screw adjustment to be fractured. So I think we haven't heard the end of this point yet, that they're going to further investigate how this came to be. There's a note about a vacuum pump being normal, but I think this is entirely irrelevant. So this entire paragraph, to me, they could have omitted this and no one would have minded that. The interesting thing, when the witness earlier said something about the engine surging, if an engine were to go past RPM redline, what can happen is the valves can hang open for too long before the springs will pull them back into place to follow the camshaft, and the piston head can strike the valve if it hangs out too close for too long. But here there was nothing anomalous about the cylinder, and the prop governor failure would explain an RPM overspeed, but everything here looks normal with the propeller governor. So again, the whole engine surging theory, to me, doesn't really hold much water right now. I'd be very surprised if they found any evidence that the engine was abnormally surging. You would think if it was abnormally surging that the aircraft would have started turning back earlier than reaching 1,000 feet AGL. A couple of other interesting things that I noticed: the flaps were extended approximately 10 degrees. It's hard to know if this happened right before impact or if this was a continuation of the takeoff situation. You do not want to have flaps in there if you're trying to glide to the runway. So this was increasing drag, probably not by too much. It probably wasn't too much drag, but ideally you're doing a glide with no flaps. That is the cleanest way to have an airplane. You don't want any more drag. Another thing that I noticed was the cowl flaps were in the open position. These will take a couple of knots away, as these are typically air scoops that scoop air in and is used for additional cooling for the engine. If you close these, you will go slightly faster. In cruise, it'll save you about maybe 2 or 3 knots. I can only imagine that if they would have closed the cowl flaps, if they would have put the flaps up, those are variables that we really wish we could know if that would have led to a more positive outcome, but it's impossible to speculate that at this point. But these are things that I noticed as I was looking through, the things that could have possibly been done a little bit differently to improve the outcome. So in conclusion, I think a valve stuck issue would explain the engine being shut off prior to takeoff and then restarted, followed by a takeoff and then another sudden loss of power event. To me, that lines up as a completely sensical narrative that would explain why this happened the way it did, and led 2 very experienced pilots to believe that everything would be all right when they departed after the symptoms went away. They thought they had the confidence that everything is now fine. We're going to proceed as normal with the plan. We're not going to call it off because everything looks normal. And they proceed, and then the valve gets stuck. There's a sudden loss of power, and they make the decision to turn back to the airport, and they don't make it back. Again, another reason why the partial power losses like these can manifest as you're losing most of your power, but not all of it. They can tempt us into thinking that we have enough power to hold altitude. It looks like, are we holding altitude? And we can think we have enough to make it back. We are too often going with our training that says, ooh, you've lost 100% of your power. Now what are you going to do? And only in those instances do we consider seriously putting the airplane down on a golf course or on a road or something that is close, that's underneath us, that we know that we can make it. Instead, we try to make it that last couple hundred feet, and sadly, they were only 200 feet from making it. And they were, in my opinion, with this not complete partial, but more of a, somewhere between a partial and complete loss of power, they were tempted to make the airport. They tried to make it, and they were unsuccessful. And if it was just 200 feet more of energy, there could have been a vastly different outcome in this case. And we could right now be listening to a video of Richard explaining what he did in the situation to remedy the problem. We'll wait to find out to see if there's any engine monitoring data or if there's any other evidence that the valve stem did not have enough clearance between itself and the guide as they take the engine apart and examine it to find out what could have possibly made it experience a sudden power loss when there's no compromising of the integrity of the cylinders. There's no oil leaking. There's very few things that can happen to cause engine power loss. Either the fuel was somehow cut off, which they seem to have traced all the fuel lines to show that most everything looked spot on correct, or it could be a valve sticking open. So the top two candidates for me are a stuck valve and some sort of fuel system malfunction. But again, I think a fuel system malfunction would have prevented them from taking off and would have manifested in a different way that could have prevented an accident. I really feel like the stuck valve problem can manifest itself early as morning sickness that goes away. That is a rough running engine right after you start it, and then it goes away, and then it comes back screaming later when it gets stuck in the valve guide at high power settings and manifests into a full engine failure. So a major point I want to make here is, even though this video, there's a lot of speculation about what could have happened, I think it's important that we think about the lessons of what if this is really what happened. So what if there really was a stuck valve issue that had morning sickness involved, where the engine was rough during startup or during the taxi? They shut the engine down, they started it back up, and the problem went away, at least temporarily, only to come raging back at the most critical part of a flight. What can we learn from this as pilots and improve who we are as pilots? If we ever notice morning sickness, ground the airplane immediately. Even if the symptoms go away, this is an imminent threat to the safety of the flight. Shut the airplane down and do not fly. If you made it this far, I'd like to thank you for watching it all the way through. So if you like this video, I have more videos here and here that are really interesting accident investigations. You can subscribe by clicking the button right here underneath my nose. I look forward to talking to you. Thank you for your likes and subscribes. And this is Malibu Mike signing off. Have a good evening.